The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
We're on the ground in some of the world's toughest places. Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. Or at least that's the theory on this, the 68th and final daily episode of Politics at Jack and Sam's for this autumn.
You've been counting them, Sam. Very impressive. You are listening to this on the morning of Thursday, December the 19th. It is the final day of the parliamentary term, the final day at work before the holidays start for at least some of us. And how else are we going to go out, Sam, but in style by overdosing on Keir Starmer this afternoon? My name is Jack Blanchard of Politico. With me, as you can hear, Sam Coates of Sky News. We're going to spend the afternoon watching the Prime Minister on TV. What a treat for all of us.
I think we ought to start with a confession because we can't not be honest to our listeners. You are listening to this on Thursday morning, but for pretty much the first time deliberately since we started the daily podcast back in May, we're cheating. We're actually both having Thursday morning off. No 5 a.m. alarm. We're recording this early on Wednesday afternoon, allowing us to enjoy one final night of term without the cursed alarm at dawn. And all I've got to say is, Jack, sorry, not sorry. 68 early starts is a lot.
I wish I was really making the most of it by going out for some sort of big rave on Wednesday night. Actually, what I'm doing is taking my children to the Chancellor's Christmas party at number 11 Downing Street on Wednesday evening, which is a very nice thing to do, but I suspect it will be more cups of tea and mince pies rather than tequila shots until dawn, sadly.
You are a fine, upstanding human being, which you always have been on this podcast. In comparison to me, I, by contrast, will not be giving a running commentary of my evening.
Ooh,
anyway, let's get on with... Let's get on with Thursday's agenda. There are basically only two big things. One is the midday decision by the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee on interest rates, and the other is at 2:30, and that's when Keir Starmer will appear for 90 minutes before the liaison committee, which is the select committee which has chairs of other select committees all questioning the Prime Minister. Jack, do you want to start off by sort of outlining what matters?
Yeah, I mean, the liaison committee, I've heard it rather excitedly described as the super committee of Parliament because all its members are select committee chairs in their own right. Unfortunately, for those of us that have spent enough time watching these liaison committee sessions over the years, they're not always actually that super, but they are the biggest hitters on parliamentary's backbenches in theory, and they do get the Prime Minister all to themselves for a 90-minute session every few months. And this is the first time Keir Starmer will have faced such a grilling. The liaison committee took absolutely ages to get organised. I think they were squabbling about who was going to chair it. In the end, the chair is Dame Meg Hillier, the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, a Labour MP. And actually, I was just going through the list of people who are on the liaison committee. There's a lot of Labour MPs. They obviously split it up, as we know, based on the sort of balance of power in Parliament. There's only 8 or 9 Tories and the 30-odd people who are allowed to sit on the liaison committee, which rather makes you think just how much of a grilling is Keir Starmer really going to get anyway. Given many of the people who are going to be doing the grilling are on his side. However, the flip side to that, Sam, is that these MPs like to make a name for themselves. They like to show off the fact that they've been charged with this important task of holding the Prime Minister to account, and they don't want to be seen to be going easy on him. And so you might still see a fair bit of showboating as they all try and grab that viral clip that actually makes the news bulletins on Thursday night, if anybody actually manages to do that.
Don't underestimate some of the people sitting around that table. I have to say, 3 people who I would pick out as being must-listens. The chair herself, Dame Meg Hillier, she actually did a very good job at the Public Accounts Committee, and now she's chairing the Treasury Select Committee, has always been really very impressive and forensic, and I don't think she really cares 2 hoots whose side she's on. She does the job properly. Liam Byrne, occasionally controversial figure chairing the Business Select Committee, he comes into his own in this kind of stuff. He actually immerses himself in the details. So Woebetide Keir Starmer, if, as some in Downing Street have said, is not completely across the detail on some of the trickier industrial strategy stuff, Liam Byrne might get him. And Emily Thornberry, one-time shadow cabinet colleague of Keir Starmer, then slung out into the wilderness by the now Prime Minister when he entered number 10. She is just as robust as they come on the Labour side. So that's the popcorn moment in terms of red on red.
Yeah, Emily Thornberry, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and so lots of hot topics for her to get into. And as you say, you suspect not a great deal of love lost there. Probably the biggest Tory hitters, such as they are in there, are Karen Bradley, who chairs the Home Affairs Committee. She's a Tory MP, so you can expect her to really try and get stuck in, you would think, on immigration. Although, of course, the problem that the Tories have, as we've seen repeatedly, is that when they try and go hard on immigration, Labour can just turn around and say, well, look what a mess you made of it. And Geoffrey Clifton-Brown will be the other one, the new chair of the Public Accounts Committee. He's got a big job. He is a Tory. They're probably the two to watch out for from a Tory point of view. Let's get into some of the stuff that Keir Starmer is going to be asked about, Sam, because this is essentially the first chance that backbench MPs have had to really press the Prime Minister on his record after, 5.5, coming up to 6 months in power now. Obviously, he does weekly Prime Minister's question sessions, but as anyone who was unfortunate enough to sit through PMQs on Wednesday, or indeed any Wednesday, will have seen, it's not exactly the most... Not a lot of light is shone, is it, in these sessions, Sam?
It was dreadful. Prime Minister's questions is more art than science, but it felt much more like crayon than fine pencil and delicate paint, I have to say. It's Christmas, guys. There was barely a gag in sight. The Keir and Kemi show can mean the only people are crackers are the ones left sitting watching it at home. Anyway, you're right. Let's get on with what might come up on Thursday. What's going to top it off?
Well, I mean, I think the point is that PMQs, you get one question, the Prime Minister barely even bothers to even try and answer it, and then he moves on to the next one. The thing in theory that's better about liaison committee is you get proper back and forth. He can't just get away with sort of giving some half-hearted, half-arsed, wave my hand away, take the next question answer, because the senior MP sitting opposite will say, no, Prime Minister, let's try that again, and ask again and again and again until they get some sort of answer out of him. And so even though these things often don't produce big news lines, and certainly with Keir Starmer in the chair, not the most exciting Prime Minister we've ever had, as I think we may have mentioned on this podcast, he will at least be forced to give semi-proper answers on some of the key issues. You know, the economy is obviously going to be one of the biggest things that they want to talk to him about, how the budget has gone, how the public finances are, and some of the things that we've been talking about on this podcast, particularly in terms of future projections for the economy, are bound to come up because, Sam, you know, this is a Prime Minister that came in making very big promises on growth. He has tried to sidestep away from some of those promises over recent weeks when it's become abundantly clear that he was never going to meet them. It will be interesting to see whether any of the MPs on the committee with a sort of financial head on them, I'm thinking Meg Hillier herself, I'm thinking Liam Byrne, as you mentioned, one or two others as well, can try and get some sort of sense out of the Prime Minister about what is your plan for future years? Like, where is the money coming from beyond the 12 months ahead to actually restore Britain's prisons and get the railways working again and get the NHS over the hump that it's in at the moment and all the rest of it? Where is the cash actually coming from? Because frankly, for all the noise around Labour so far, we haven't really heard a straight answer on any of that.
The live news on Thursday, I think, provides quite an interesting backdrop. So the lunchtime Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee decision is likely to see interest rates held at 4.75%, right? Now, I think Labour's best shot at an economic miracle in the second half of this parliament bluntly rests in interest rates coming down faster than the current projections would suggest. But the problem for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer is that, if anything, interest rates are likely to stay slightly higher than anybody would want, because the problem with inflation is slightly bigger than anybody would have wanted. And on Wednesday, the day that we're talking to you, yesterday, if you're listening to this podcast, inflation was at 2.6%, which is higher than people were expecting. It's partly as a result of, petrol and diesel, but the cost of everything is just going up a bit. And if, for instance, the Ukraine war or events in the Middle East take a turn for the worse, it's going to stay higher, prices are going to stay higher, and interest rates rates are going to stay higher, and that's going to put a sort of a medium-term dampener. And the accusation that the Tories want to run is that also by pushing up national insurance and the various tax rises, inflation is going up because of decisions the government made as well. So I would argue that the backdrop, the decisions being made by the Bank of England yesterday and the Wednesday inflation result don't provide the kindest sort of setting for the grilling.
The other sort of straw or big policy plank that Keir Starmer will grasp for is the sort of structural investment and structural changes that the Labour say they are making in terms of the economy. One would be big investment in infrastructure projects, and we saw Rachel Reeves announce an awful lot of borrowing back in October, some of which is going to be ploughed into big projects, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure over the next few years. The other, of course, is supply-side reforms like planning reforms, which we've started to see some of the detail now on, although none of that is actually in place yet. And Labour will argue that over time, that sort of investment in the economy and those sorts of changes to allow building to happen much more quickly will indeed grow the economy faster than it currently is doing. The problem, of course, Sam, is how quickly is that ever going to happen in a world where you have to deliver results before the next election if you're going to get re-elected on anything like the sorts of numbers that Labour got elected in July.
But this is where being across the detail it's going to be fascinating, bluntly, to see whether Keir Starmer is, because there's a house building problem. There's a massive Labour house building target of 1.5 million new homes before the end of the Parliament. And they have made some changes to the planning system in order to execute that. But that also depends on all sorts of other things, like whether or not interest rates come down, as we were just talking about, because that has a big impact on how private house builders build and the speed at which they do so. You've got to probably change in some way the nature and habitat rules, and there's just the beginning of a conversation in government about that. But we're nowhere near the end of that, and it'll be interesting to see whether that comes to fruition. And you've just got to ensure that there's sufficient people to do all of this building. Does that require migration? So many associated bits of the plan to get Britain building are in a less good shape than the early moves on planning. Can Keir Starmer present a coherent and convincing narrative that just because he's twiddled with one bit, the rest of it is going to happen?
Beyond the economy, Keir Starmer is going to get lots of questions about his plans for Britain's public services, which he will be the first to say, and I expect he may say many times through the course of Thursday afternoon, were not in a great shape when Labour took over them in July. I mean, you can reel off the list of things needing investment and reform, Sam, but NHS, prisons, welfare system would be three very big, obvious ticket items where Labour has prioritised, and you can understand why they're prioritising reform and investment. But the question is, like, again, where is the delivery coming from? We've seen a lot of money announced for the NHS, more money announced for the NHS, I think, than anyone was really expecting in the first few months of the Labour government. But what we haven't yet seen is a really coherent plan for reform in the NHS, which was the mantra that Labour banged on and on and on about before the election. No extra funding without reform. We've got to change the way it works. Wes Streeting talked about this a huge amount. We've had a review, but we haven't yet seen a real plan, and it will be interesting to see whether Keir Starmer's got anything to say about how you actually get NHS onto a more stable and successful footing. And of course, with social care being the other thing that's hanging over that, and we've heard almost nothing from Labour at all on social care. And how do you possibly fix the NHS without fixing social care as well?
Labour would say that the public services were in a worse state they were expecting when they come into power. I'd say that Labour's public service reform plans are in a worse state than anybody was expected when they come in. Look, take the NHS. Everybody thinks Wes Streeting, the health secretary, is probably the biggest moderniser reformer in the cabinet. Fine, that's all well and good. He's definitely a good media performer. But on Wednesday, the day that we're speaking to you, so yesterday when you're listening to this podcast, Wes Streeting was before a select committee. And I have to say my jaw dropped a bit at what he said. So we are expecting in the spring, probably in May, a 10-year plan for modernising the NHS, the big reform plan that I had thought they'd done a lot of thinking of in opposition. And he said that when you get this plan, it will be a clear plan of action and delivery over this term and in this Parliament. But then he said the document hasn't been written yet. The plan is not already finalised, written, drafted. I don't have some kind of secret draft in my drawer. I think it's only right that it's produced with people rather than done to people. I think there's a better way of doing policy, a better way of driving reform. Why on earth didn't he have a plan a secret plan in his top drawer when he came into office. Some of the cabinet ministers think they did. But already that NHS plan has slipped to May because I think there are difficulties around it and there are questions about how they're going to secure the funding to do reform. But it's going to address some very, very knotty things that again, Labour hadn't really come up with a plan with in opposition. He said there's no solution to the NHS crisis that doesn't involve a solution in social care. On the 10-year plan, I think we need for social care, alongside the 10-year plan for health, we'll be setting that all out in the new year, and then we will build that plan. So he admits he doesn't have a plan for social care, but says there'll be one by May, effectively. But that's a solution to a problem that has bedeviled governments for 20 years and my entire life as a political reporter. It baffles me that even the person meant to be at the cutting edge of reform is turning up, looking in his briefcase, not really finding anything. And I just don't understand how this ended up happening.
Yeah, and similarly on welfare, Sam, Labour have been pretty clear they're going to seek to find many of the big savings that the Tories were talking about finding before the election. Labour have been pretty clear they can't just let the welfare bill continue to spiral in the way that it has. And yet, so far, where is the detail on how this is going to happen, and happen in a way that Labour MPs will consider to be fair to the more struggling members of society? Debbie Abrahams, I'm sure the Working Pensions Committee Chair, will be pressing Keir Starmer on that. I'm not expecting very much in the way of detailed answers because I don't think they've got any yet on that either. Let's just talk about global affairs and security, Sam, because that'll be the other big section that the MPs want to talk to the Prime Minister about. There's obviously a couple of three very, very big conflicts happening around the world right now. It goes without saying. Is it fair to say that on global affairs, Keir Starmer's probably done all right? I mean, he's made a reasonable fist of resetting relations with the EU as far as that goes in the first few months without any real specifics. He's made a reasonable fist of starting to have a decent relationship with Donald Trump. That could have been a catastrophe. It hasn't been a catastrophe so far. The Middle East crisis is a very, very, very difficult thing for Labour to handle. It hasn't been a disaster for him in any specific, personal political sense so far. He's, as far as he can help with Ukraine, he's pushed on Storm Shadow, which I think is what generally people in Britain wanted. We got there in the end, albeit slower than people would have wanted. Is he kind of done okay here?
Keir Starmer's ended up putting a lot more effort into foreign affairs than people were expecting, hence the almost daily jokes about Keir Starmer being out of the country that we've subjected you on this podcast. We're at the phase of foreign affairs where he's sort of done the grip and grin. He's gone around lots of parts of the world, rebuilding some relationships and cementing others. But he hasn't got to the bit of foreign affairs where he's had to make trade-offs. And in the current global environment, it is very likely he's going to have to choose. He wants to duck choices. He wants to have his cake and eat it, but that probably isn't going to be possible. So whether that's a choice between the EU and Donald Trump, whether it's a choice between backing Zelensky or backing, in the end, some kind of compromise plan that sees Ukraine giving up territory, whether it involves getting closer to China and risking a backlash from the US, none of the choices he's needed to make yet, but they all do look like they're coming down the track. And so I think as we sort of move into 2025, I think the question of showing your hand a little bit when decisions are not just, should I go and see this world leader and be nice to them and have a nice meal, translate into, I've got to make a concrete choice because I'm either going to upset the Chinese or Donald Trump or both of them, and I don't want to do that.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And of course, one of the other big strategic choices he'll have to make in 2025 is around defence spending, which rather takes us full circle back to the economic argument we were making at the top. He's sort of said, very clearly he's going to get Britain on a path to spending 2.5% of defence on GDP. We're going to have to see some detail of that pretty soon if it's going to look remotely credible. And given the financial constraints Keir Starmer says he is under, it's very hard to see where he's going to find that money without some big cuts somewhere else. And this Labour government does not look in the mood for making big cuts anywhere to me. So it's hard to see how he's going to find that money. And I'm sure that Tad Daisy, the Labour MP who chairs the Defence Committee, is going to press him on that on Thursday. Once again, are we going to get any realistic answers out of the Prime Minister? It's hard to believe that we are.
And that is it. The timer is upon us and it's all over. It's all over for Christmas. It's frankly all over. I'm going to go and lie in a darkened room. Jack, after 136 episodes, how do you feel right now?
feel absolutely brilliant because it's not 6 o'clock in the morning when I'm recording it, and what a pleasure it is to talk to you on a sort of sunny December afternoon. Maybe we've completely lost our minds doing this thing every morning. Maybe the whole thing was a really bad idea, Sam. What do you think?
I think it's been brilliant, and I look forward to everybody listening to this podcast in the new year when we return at the start of January to give you everything you need to know in the day ahead in British politics from First Thing. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Merry Christmas, everybody. Thank you.
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel,
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
and we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
We're on the ground in some of the world's toughest places. Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.